Hello and welcome. My name is Narelle Doan, and I'm the Director of Marketing for Viking Pure Solutions. Thank you so much for joining us today for our conversation, Leading from the Front Line, What Real Support Looks Like in Senior Living. I'm really excited for this conversation because it's part of a broader series that we've been building, highlighting and elevating voices of strong women leaders across senior living. We have had the opportunity to speak with several incredible female operators and executives, and one theme continues to come through. When women in this industry share their experiences openly, it doesn't just inspire, it helps build up the next generation of leaders. And that's really the intention of today's conversation. We're here to create space for real practical insights, not just leadership theory, but what it actually looks like to lead, support teams, and show up consistently in a very demanding environment. And I couldn't think of a better person to have this conversation with today than Michele Sepples. She is the Vice President of Operations at Willow Ridge Senior Living. Michele, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Narelle. As you shared, my name's Michele Sepples, and I'm the Vice President of Operations for Willow Ridge Senior Living. We are a growing operator that has really been primarily focused on acquiring and improving independent assisted living and memory care communities across multiple markets at this point. My role with the organization is to onboard new teams to our Willow Ridge family and support them in making sure that the communities we bring onto our team don't just operate, but actually perform once they become parts of our family. That has really meant for us evaluating and right-sizing labor, driving occupancy, strengthening accountability across our teams, continuing to ensure that the quality of our care remains consistent and at an exceptional level. Over the last 2 years, we've grown from 6 to nearly 30 communities and counting. And what has really forced us to focus on, how we scale without losing connection to what's actually happening in every building. So I think it's a great topic for conversation today. I'm really glad to be able to meet with you today.
Awesome. Well, before we get into it, to those joining us, please feel free to pop some questions in the Q&A section or in the chat. We will be happy to address those at the end. And yeah, let's get into it. So, Michele, I've heard from a couple of your coworkers and leadership there at Willow Ridge that you are known for staying deeply connected to both your leadership teams and your frontline staff. This is something that's challenging to do in practice, of course. How would you personally define leading from the front line?
Great question. I think for me, leading from the front line really means staying close enough to people at all levels of the organization to actually understand what's happening. It's very easy as, organizations grow to have your information sources become a bit of a silo. And I think ensuring that communication remains open is a huge part of, what I've had to focus on over the last 2 years. I spent a long time as an executive director, and I think that experience really allowed me to learn quickly that what people say, what they mean, and what's actually happening can sometimes have some degree of difference. And at this level, as our organization has grown, I've really seen those gaps don't shrink, they amplify. So it's not just about showing up, but it's now, as we're, quickly rounding into 30 communities, it's about being present enough now to discern kind of what are signals or patterns of something that needs to be addressed from noise and then respond to what actually matters, because it can get really easy to get distracted by, many different things that can pull you off course.
For sure. Yes, especially on the executive director level, just being spread so thin in some cases because just that's how the workload taps out.
Absolutely.
When people hear stay connected to your teams, this phrase can sound abstract. What does daily connection actually look like when you're dealing with 30 plus communities? I think you guys are at 32 now, 36.
We're at 31, two of which are not operating quite
Okay,
yet, and we have a pretty healthy pipeline for the remainder of this year. So
that's great.
I expecting pretty similar growth to the last 2 years, which is very exciting. But I think at our scale, connection has had to become more and more intentional. You know, it, you know, Maintaining that regular cadence with our leaders. I think a big focus for us recently has been visibility into our metrics. And, I think most importantly, and the lever that will never change is being present in our communities. being present in our communities is something that we really believe in as a discipline. I think it's how you validate what you're hearing from your leaders. So it allows you to validate, are we hearing the same story at every level when we're, approaching an issue? Does what's being said actually matter, match what's happening, and being able to kind of identify where communication is breaking down, because that's where your execution breaks down. So
Mm,
being present allows us to identify those patterns before they become bigger problems, and give people the confidence that you're actually listening to, you know, respond and do something with the information, then rather than to just check off that I listened,
yes. We talked. Done.
Absolutely.
That's not
It's
far enough.
funny. My husband was in the industry for a brief time in his 20s, and he told me a story very early in our relationship about, and I was not with Willow Ridge at this point, but shared a story with me very early in our relationship about working in a community where someone at a high level in the organization came to appreciate the team, and he remembered very specifically like the look on this person in the high level position's face as they like came to deliver a pizza, and he sort of had that feeling of like that check mark, like I said, and it just that story has always stuck with me. So I really try to look in the mirror on that.
Yeah. Check your face at the door.
Definitely.
What are some non-negotiables in how you show up every week?
I think I know I'm kind of harping on the same drum, but presence is non-negotiable. I think it's, you know, we, I being in the communities, being able to see and validate, what we're talking about with the executive directors every day, being able to hear whether that's consistent on all levels of the community is absolutely huge. I think right along with that is clear expectations, clear communication, and a direct connection to the building. Being part of those town hall meetings every couple months, being part of those employee meetings, and just making sure that you're reacting instead of, you're not just reacting, but you're leading, and really working with the communities to, you know, help enforce what they're trying to achieve and our overall strategy, but feeling supported through it.
For sure. Can you share a recent example where staying closely connected really made a difference for a team or a community that you're working with?
Definitely. I think really, really recently, we've had some situations that should have been handled locally and escalated because of that breakdown in communication and execution. Because our team stays present, once we identified what was taking place, we were able to step in quickly. I think during transitions, that's especially important. When we're taking over communities, we're not just stepping in to, take over operations and maintain the status quo. We're stepping into people's lives, and one of the things that we do very consistently before we take on new communities is transition meetings where we're meeting with the executive director, the department director staff, the frontline staff, and then ultimately the residents and families. And consistently, we have employees that are worried that after years and years of building credibility, they're going to have to prove themselves over or start over again. And families wondering if everything that they love about the community will change. And so we have to balance those fears against, the commitments we've made to our investors, and find that right balance. And really, the only way to navigate that well is to listen, to have discernment and knowing what needs to change and what needs to be protected, and to walk through this with the communities. And that's really been the secret to our success, I think.
Yeah, change is hard for everybody.
Definitely.
But yeah, I get that, like needing to clarify, okay, like these are the things that are going to change, and then these are the things that aren't going to change, and then these are the other things that we can kind of talk about and figure out as we go.
Absolutely. And being honest that things will change. I think it's very, it is hard because people in that situation many times they have things that they really want to change, but they also have things that they really don't want to change, and kind of saying like, very honestly, like some of the things that you love are going to probably shift a little bit, but some of the things that you really need some action on are also going to be addressed really quickly. And we're going to be honest about both sides of that.
Yeah, you may not have lemony fresh scented cleaners anymore because
Absolutely. You might not have three people between you and a med cart anymore.
Mhm.
The
Yeah,
layers might have to shrink a little bit.
yeah, let's streamline operations and make everything run more smoothly, which equates to better care and a better living experience for residents.
Absolutely.
What is something that frontline teams need from leadership that they don't really often get in your experience?
I think follow up, we often find that we hear an issue and there's an awareness of the issue. And because of, different things that are happening, especially in as many acquisitions as we do, many communities are aware that the operation is going to be selling, and there begins to be some gaps in how the communities are managed up until the point of sale. And so we're often finding that teams are feeling a little bit ignored, and then they finally get a chance to share feedback and start to see some things change. But if we're not rounding back and saying, hey, this is where we are, this is, the timeline that this is going to take, you can very easily get into the nothing has changed, place with teams. And so I think that rounding back and letting people know where we are and kind of what to expect as time goes, and then also evaluating that, and sometimes sitting in the tough feedback that you need to readdress some of the stuff that you haven't, taken care of for the community, 2 or 3 months down the line, and make sure that you're following through and keeping your side of the street clean as well.
That's
So
really important. And I feel like leaders in any industry maybe sometimes forget that. Like communicating and showing up for your people is also, we're human, we make mistakes, like, and owning up for that. And then like, okay, here's the gaps that we still need to fill. Let's work together to fill them. That's really good.
definitely. As you know, we have an upcoming leadership summit where we're gathering our executive directors and sales teams for 3 days of training and team building and stuff like that. And we sent out a survey in advance of the summit asking for some feedback, and asked, what is some feedback that would be hard for us to hear. And to be honest with you, I was really appreciative of our team. Some of the feedback was hard to hear. Some of it was, to read that feedback in real time. There was some tough things to digest, but I think what it allowed us to do as a team was to, really think about the experience from the employee side, re-engage, get more context, in some cases, own our part of things or our organization's part in their experience, that we're willing, we're we're listening, we're going to adjust as needed. And I think that's really where trust builds. You can't expect a relationship to be perfect, but if you acknowledge where you are in the relationship and where you come off course, you can very easily get back on, which is great.
Yeah, for sure. Kind of jumping off of that, where do you think trust breaks down more often?
Um, I think it is in the lack of follow-up, or in sometimes when follow-up is hard to share because it's not the answer that we want. And so I know that something that I was very guilty of early in my career was, if I didn't feel confident about the answer that I was going to give someone, I would kick the can down the road and maybe not answer that family's phone call for an extra day or something like that. And ultimately, I would find through really hard lessons, when someone is very rightfully saying, you should have called me back after 2 days or something, that's not the right way to operate. So I think, it really is discernment in deciding, what those priorities are, and making sure that you are communicating on those things and re-communicating on those things as conditions change, so that we're on the same page. Because especially as our team has grown bigger, who we are having to get the message out to, especially considering new teams onboarding, changes to teams and stuff like that, can definitely get complex. But it can become very easy when you're adding, 5 or 6 communities at a time, to have to go back and go, did we teach this team about that? And so just circling back, asking for that feedback, seeing where the gaps are, has been huge for us. And it's just, being being curious and asking those questions has helped me a lot.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it a little bit too, but having that consistency. I have a toddler, and so I'm constantly reminding myself, like, okay, these are the boundaries. I have to stick with them. But like in terms of working with a team, it's like being consistent myself, and like, am I, being consistent in my practices as well?
Definitely.
For leaders trying to strengthen trust in their organizations, what's one thing that they should start doing differently tomorrow, like right now?
I think ask for that feedback. And as I shared with the Leadership Summit example, be willing to sit in some of it. I think I talked a little bit about looking in the mirror earlier, and it's something that I always, when I was an executive director, I always tried to kind of end my day with, being very self-reflective and sitting in some of the hard feedback because it usually is the most valuable. And so I think when you combine your willingness to listen, your willingness to accept that someone else's experience might not have been consistent with yours, and then actually be present so that you can act on it meaningfully, you're going to win as a leader. You're always going to have challenges to face, but I think if you're building trust, then you always have an avenue to continue to grow. And so that's number one core value, I think, for me.
I love that. For folks listening in, feel free to pop in a question or two in the Q&A or the chat. We'd be happy to address those in a little bit here. Um, one more question for you, or another question for you, actually, Michele. We hear a lot of advice in this industry about, being more visible, especially in the leadership role. In your experience, where do operators tend to get this wrong? And if visibility isn't enough, what actually builds credibility with your teams?
I think visibility, kind of to build on the example I shared about my husband and, the vice president who showed up with the 2 bottles of soda. I think visibility can easily get confused with presence.
Yeah.
Showing up isn't enough. Being at the building and sitting in, the office with the executive director for 9 hours is not being present for the community. So I think it's, understanding what's happening, communicating with all levels of the organization, validating what you're hearing and putting eyes on it is important. And then following through. So I think using your presence to identify patterns and not just react you're only able to do that if you are actually engaging with everyone and present rather than here. I have had a couple of recent we've been in a big growth boom over the last couple of months, and I had a few experiences in December and January when we were in heavy growth mode where I was sitting in a community, but because of the volume of other transition calls I had to be on and stuff like that, I really had to be self-reflective about changing, how I'm entering communities, because sitting in an office, looking at a screen, talking to other people is definitely not what makes people, feel good about Willow Ridge. And I think just the ability to recognize that, to reevaluate yourself, to be self-reflective both in your own performance and in how you're showing up as a team is really important and just, helps you maintain that credibility.
Yeah. And that kind of changes sometimes when you arrive on site too. Like you might show up at a community and it's like you expected to do one thing and then you realize the need is different today.
Absolutely. You are
Gonna need to
right.
cancel my afternoon
Yeah, like
because these people
three
need more
people didn't
time.
show up for work. Our executive director is trying to be on a med cart, run a tour, do 27 things, and I'm trying to get them to sit down with me and talk about how they were 12 hours over on labor last week.
Yeah,
Like,
you're like, okay, now I see. Now let's work on
absolutely.
fixing this problem.
Definitely.
Yeah. What is a way that like ineffective visibility comes across? Is it kind of like you said, being, your butt is in a seat, but you're not actually present because you're not. What's kind of
Yeah,
another example of that?
yeah, I think that's definitely a strong example. I think the showing up kind of for the ceremonial, kind of the ceremonial, I stopped at your employee party. I think it really is you know, about getting, I think one of the things I value the most, I know I'm rambling a little bit, but one thing that I really value is relationships that kind of consistently grow over time at every community. So one of the privileges of getting to go on those transition meetings is that you very quickly identify who the characters are in the community and kind of who the thought leaders are.
Mm,
And being able to consistently follow up with them because they tend to speak for many people who are not willing to speak or tend to get information to many people who don't always, don't always come to the meeting or don't always engage fully, has been really beneficial for me. So I love, those ongoing relationships where, we have a 29-year housekeeper in one of our communities in Tennessee, and every time I see her, we're able to build on that relationship or to reflect on something that's changed in the community. And so I think it really is about, not, like I said, not just the executive director, not just the department director team, but really, knowing those key players on the staff and being present and able to hear from everyone so that you can bring that feedback back and say, here's something I heard. What if we approach this issue this way? Often your best solutions are going to come from your line staff because they're living it and they're having to adapt when things aren't perfect
Yes.
and you're not necessarily there. So they will generally give you a better answer than almost anybody else.
For sure. Yeah, we were talking about this a few weeks ago with Aaron Hennessy and Zevi Petras from Priority Life Care. And what was a huge kind of pivotal point in the conversation, which I think you watched it and remember, but how housekeeping team members are often a huge part of the care team and can tell you so much more than maybe even the like official caregiver or nurse could tell you in a given day about a resident and what they're going through and what needs to kind of happen with them to make things better. That's
Yep,
just wild to me, and it's so wonderful and also something that isn't called out enough in my opinion. um,
definitely.
yeah. Last question. If you had to boil it down, what is one mindset shift that leaders need to make to truly support their teams today in senior living?
I think I would have to go with adaptability. We have seen a huge shift in how executive directors and community leaders have to approach the job, both in terms of how the industry has changed in the post-COVID world and as well as market conditions. So, we're really, we know that we're asking our leaders to ride a really difficult line in kind of managing reports versus managing reality, and reality changes.
Mhm.
How we are winning today is different than it was a few years ago. We have historically looked for communities with lower cost bases with a lot of opportunity in terms of occupancy improvement or labor restructuring and stuff like that. And our market prices are getting higher, so we have to not just rely on our basis, but also rely on being able to quickly pull those levers to make the changes that a community needs. And that is definitely relying on, adaptability and trust. Our CEO, Mike Morris, says often, he'll refer to the idea from Charles Darwin about it's not the strongest or the most intelligent that survive, it's the ones that are most responsive to change. And I think
Yes.
that's what we're seeing as an industry, both within the community environment as well as in the market as a whole. And the leaders that are winning, the operators that are winning are the ones that stay present, that listen, that identify those problems from 5,000 or 500 feet, no matter, depending on where your perspective is, whether you're an ED or higher up in an organization, and then make the adjustments that are needed while staying grounded and rooted in your values. And so you have to balance performance with people, and you can only do that by being adaptable. So I think for me, that's the one of the most important pieces I look for in leaders as I'm evaluating, who's going to lead our communities through that transition.
Yeah. Can you be adaptable? That's huge. Well, it doesn't look like we have any questions, so I'll give it another minute or two. But thank you so much for joining me. This has been a wonderful kind of lunchtime chat, and it's just been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Absolutely. Thank you. My pleasure. This was wonderful.
All right. Well, to everyone joining us, thank you again. And I will follow up later today with the replay from today so you can share it with anyone who's interested. Feel free to also reply to that email with any questions for myself or Michelle, and I will be happy to share those with her. And once again, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.